Maplewood Heights had always been a peaceful suburban neighborhood, a place where families thrived, children played in the streets, and everyone knew each other by name. The houses were modest, with neatly manicured lawns, flower beds, and big oak trees, providing a gentle canopy of shade. It was the kind of place where life moved at a slow and steady pace, and the streets echoed with laughter and the occasional sound of lawnmowers humming in the background. But today, a different kind of noise filled the air, one that shattered the serenity of the neighborhood. At the center of the disturbance stood a house on Oakwood Lane, a two-story home that had seen better days. The lawn was overgrown, the windows slightly dusty, and the front door cracked open, as if it had been a long time since it had been properly cared for. The house, once a happy home for a young family, was now the setting for an eviction, an event that would mark the end of a chapter for the Turner family, who had called this place home for years. Carla Dawson, a legal representative for the property management company handling the eviction, stepped out of her car and walked up the driveway, her heels clicking on the concrete. Dressed in a black suit, with a professional air about her, she held a folder in her hand containing the eviction notice and other legal documents. Her role was clear: to oversee the eviction of the Turner family, who had fallen behind on their rent payments for months. The notice had been served weeks ago, and now the family had run out of time. Despite the legal justification for the eviction, Carla couldn't help but feel a pang of sympathy for the Turners. She had seen this scenario play out countless times before. Evictions were a necessary part of her job, but they were never easy. She was accustomed to seeing families caught in financial hardship, people who had struggled to make ends meet, only to find themselves in this moment of crisis. As much as she tried to keep her emotions at bay, there was always a human element to these situations that couldn't be ignored. As she approached the front gate of the house, she spotted Officer Greg Harper standing nearby. Harper was a seasoned sheriff, one who had handled more than his fair share of evictions in his time on the force. His face was calm, but there was a hint of weariness in his eyes. He had seen the distress these situations caused firsthand, and he understood how volatile things could get when people were faced with losing their homes. "Everything ready?" Carla asked as she approached him. Harper nodded. "Yeah, but we've got to be careful. We don't want this to get out of hand. I've seen how these things can escalate, especially when people feel like they have nothing left." Carla nodded. "I know. That's why I'm here, to make sure things go smoothly." As they spoke, a moving truck rolled up in front of the house, its engine sputtering to a halt. A group of movers began unloading boxes, furniture, and other personal belongings from the Turner family's home. The sight was a stark reminder of how much had been lost in this process. Not just a house, but a place filled with memories, with laughter and tears, now reduced to a pile of boxes and a final, irreversible decision. The air was heavy with tension. The eviction was official, and the process had begun. But for Carla, it felt like the first step into a storm that would not only change the Turner family's life, but also leave a mark on her own. Inside the house, the Turner family's world was crumbling. Mark Turner, the father, paced nervously in the living room. His once proud home now felt like a stranger's, every corner filled with the weight of impending loss. His wife, Julia, was in the kitchen, trying to gather their two young children, who were too young to understand the full scope of what was happening, but could feel the tension thick in the air. The house, once full of laughter and the warmth of family life, was now eerily silent, save for the sound of boxes being packed and the occasional bump as furniture was moved out the door. Mark ran his hands through his hair in frustration, trying to reconcile the hopelessness he felt. He knew this moment had been coming for months. Rent payments had been falling behind, bills had piled up, and no matter how hard he worked, there never seemed to be enough money to catch up. Julia had tried to stay positive, but even she could no longer ignore the mounting pressure. They had tried everything, from applying for assistance to cutting back on basic necessities, but nothing had worked. Now, they were facing the reality that they would have to leave the home that had been their sanctuary. Mark glanced out the window and saw the moving truck parked in front of the house. The movers were busy, taking out box after box of belongings. It was all happening too fast. He felt as though he was watching his life unfold in slow motion, each moment a reminder that things were no longer under his control. His thoughts were interrupted by the sharp sound of a door opening and closing, and he turned to see Julia walking towards him. "They're here," she said quietly, her voice strained but calm. "The movers are ready." Mark nodded, his stomach tightening. "I know. I saw them." He didn't know what else to say. The words felt hollow. Julia reached out and touched his arm. "We'll get through this. It's just a setback. We'll find a way. We always do." Mark forced a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I hope so. But this feels different." The words hung heavy in the room. Outside, Carla Dawson and Officer Harper stood by the gate, watching the last of the furniture being loaded into the truck. The paperwork was complete, the eviction notice fully executed, but they knew the hardest part was still to come. The emotional toll of these situations often couldn't be predicted, and both Carla and Harper had learned over the years that emotions didn't follow a script. They had to be ready for anything. Harper looked over at Carla, his expression thoughtful. "You think they're ready for this? It's a lot to handle." Carla hesitated, glancing back toward the house. "No one ever really is. But they knew it was coming. This is just the final step." Mark emerged from the house, his eyes meeting Carla's for the first time. There was a moment of silent understanding between them. Carla had done her job, but Mark was still a person, a father, and a husband, facing the unimaginable. "I guess this is it," Mark said, his voice low, barely above a whisper. Carla nodded, her face sympathetic. "I'm sorry it had to come to this." Mark looked down, his hands trembling. "We tried everything. I don't know what happened. It's not just the rent. It's everything." His voice cracked, and he quickly looked away, wiping his eyes. Julia appeared behind him, placing a hand on his shoulder. She gave Carla a polite nod, but said nothing. The pain was written all over her face. Harper stepped forward, his presence a subtle attempt to bring some calm to the scene. "We'll help you through this. The movers will be done soon, and you can take whatever time you need. Just please remember that things will get better." But Mark wasn't so sure. He had heard it all before, the promises, the assurances that things would improve. But now, standing in front of the house he could no longer afford, the world felt like it was collapsing around him. "We've lost everything," he muttered under his breath. Carla, her own emotions carefully guarded, took a deep breath. "I understand how hard this is, but there are resources. There are options. You can rebuild." Mark didn't answer, his gaze fixed on the truck, where the last of their possessions was being loaded. The reality of what had just happened was sinking in. He was losing the only home his family had known, and the road ahead felt uncertain. As the final box was loaded onto the truck, Carla handed Mark a business card. "If you need help, if you need to find a new place or get assistance, give me a call. I'm here to help." Mark nodded absently, taking the card but not looking at it. "Thank you." With that, Carla turned and walked back towards Officer Harper, leaving the Turner family to face the next chapter of their lives. But as she glanced over her shoulder one last time, she saw Julia holding their children close, her back straight, trying to stay strong despite the pain. It was a reminder that even in the toughest of times, people did what they could to survive, to move forward. The eviction was over, but for the Turner family, it was just the beginning of a new struggle. As the moving truck drove away, the house on Oakwood Lane stood empty, its once welcoming facade now barren and lifeless. Inside, the Turner family's belongings had been packed up, their memories carefully wrapped in cardboard boxes and sealed with tape. The place that had been their home for years now seemed like a cold, abandoned structure, a stark contrast to the warmth that had once filled its rooms. For Mark and Julia, the feeling of finality was overwhelming. They stood in the doorway, gazing at the vacant house, both knowing that the life they had known here was gone. "Where do we go from here?" Julia asked quietly, breaking the silence that had settled between them. Mark didn't have an immediate answer. The question seemed to swirl in his mind like a storm he couldn't outrun. Where would they go? How would they start over? They had lost their home. But what about their dignity, their hope for the future? They had worked so hard to make this life work, yet it felt like everything was slipping through their fingers, just beyond their grasp. The weight of responsibility for his family pressed down on him, and he felt like he had failed them. He turned to Julia, his expression weary. I don't know. I wish I had answers. Julia's face was a mixture of sadness and resolve. She had always been the optimistic one, the glue that held their family together. But today, even she struggled to maintain the hope that had once defined her. She wanted to believe that this setback was just a temporary challenge, a bump in the road they could overcome. But with the eviction now behind them, the reality of their situation was too overwhelming to ignore. We'll figure it out, she said, trying to muster the strength she needed to stay positive. We always do. Mark nodded, but deep down, he knew it wasn't going to be easy. They were starting from scratch. Everything they had built, everything they had worked for, had been taken from them. Now, they would have to find a new place to live, a new way to survive. It was a daunting task, and Mark couldn't shake the feeling that their dreams had been shattered beyond repair. Outside, Officer Harper was finishing his conversation with Carla. He had seen the Turners at their most vulnerable, and he understood the gravity of the situation. While it wasn't his place to offer emotional support, he couldn't help but feel a sense of empathy for the family. He had seen countless evictions during his years on the force, but there was something about this one that felt different. The Turners had tried, he could tell. But sometimes trying wasn't enough. Sometimes life threw challenges that no amount of effort could fix. Harper glanced at Carla, his voice low as he spoke. I've seen this a lot. Families losing everything, trying to rebuild. It's never easy, but it's the system we work within. Carla nodded solemnly, her own thoughts mirroring his. I know. It's hard not to feel for them, but we have to follow the law. We have to do our jobs. They both stood in silence for a moment, watching as the Turner family began to gather their few remaining possessions. The sight was heart-wrenching, and for a brief moment, Carla wondered if there was more that could have been done, some other way to help them avoid this fate. But the eviction had been necessary. The Turner family had been given multiple chances to rectify their financial troubles, and yet they had failed to do so. The law had spoken, and it was Carla's duty to enforce it. She had done her part, but even as she drove away from the house, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had been lost in the process, not just for the Turners, but for herself as well. As she left the neighborhood, her mind wandered back to her own life. She had her own struggles, her own challenges. She worked long hours, often dealing with difficult clients and cases that weighed on her conscience. But she never let it show. She had learned long ago to compartmentalize, to separate her work from her personal life. But today, she couldn't help but feel a sense of guilt. Could there have been a way to make a difference? Could she have done more to help the Turners? Back at the Turner house, Mark and Julia sat on the steps, their children nestled beside them. They were trying to hold it together for the kids, but the weight of their situation was evident. The future was uncertain, and they had no clear path forward. But for now, they would rely on each other. They had each other, and that was something they would hold on to, no matter how difficult things became. As the day wore on, Mark and Julia made plans for the next steps. They would contact shelters, look for temporary housing, and try to get back on their feet. It would take time, but they weren't going to give up. They couldn't. The Turner family had lost their home, but they hadn't lost their resolve. And as they gathered their things and moved forward, they knew that the road ahead would be difficult. But they also knew that they had survived worse. They would find a way to rebuild, to find a new place, and to start over. The future was uncertain, but as long as they had each other, they could face whatever came next.